What happened next will shock you. But first, you need to know how a 34-year-old African president pulled off the greatest financial heist reversal in modern history, and why Wall Street executives are still losing sleep over it. The $50 billion secret that changed everything. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. Marcus Blackwell, CEO of Hemisphere Mining Corporation, jolted awake in his $15 million Manhattan penthouse. His assistant's panicked voice crackled through the secure line. "Sir, you need to see the news. Now." What Blackwell saw on his Bloomberg terminal made his blood run cold. Burkina Faso, a country he'd barely thought about since his last shareholder meeting, had just frozen all assets of Western mining companies operating in the region. The reason? Alleged theft of $50 billion in mineral wealth over 2 decades. But here's what Blackwell didn't know yet. This wasn't some desperate political stunt by another unstable African leader. This was the opening move in the most sophisticated financial chess game ever played on the global stage. The man behind it? Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who was about to prove that a military officer from one of the world's poorest countries could outsmart some of Wall Street's most ruthless executives. And the method he used? You won't believe it until you see it. The discovery that started it all. 3 months earlier, the dusty basement of Burkina Faso's Ministry of Mines held more secrets than Fort Knox. But unlike Fort Knox, nobody was guarding these secrets. They were just sitting there, waiting for someone smart enough to find them. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't supposed to be in that basement. He was supposed to be at a diplomatic dinner, smiling for cameras and making small talk with foreign ambassadors. Instead, he was crouched over a pile of documents that would make him the most feared man in international mining circles. "Monsieur le Président," whispered Dr. Aminata Ouadraogo, his chief economist, "what you're about to see will change everything you thought you knew about our country's wealth." She opened a leather-bound ledger to a page that made Traoré's jaw drop. The Geological Survey from 2003, buried and forgotten for nearly 2 decades, showed gold deposits worth $127 billion. Not million. Billion. With a B. But here's the kicker. Western mining companies had been paying royalties based on declared deposits worth only $23 billion. They had stolen $104 billion worth of information and used it to rob an entire nation. "Wait," Traoré said, his military training kicking in as he spotted something even more damning. "These signatures. Dr. Ouadraogo, look at these signatures." The contracts weren't just based on fraudulent surveys. They were signed by Burkinabe officials who had been paid off, with Western executives who knew exactly what they were doing, using geological data that proved they were lying to an entire government. Traoré felt his hands shake, not with fear but with controlled rage. His people were among the poorest on earth, yet they were sitting on enough gold to make every citizen wealthy beyond imagination. But what happened next separated Traoré from every other leader who had discovered such corruption. Instead of getting angry, he got strategic. And his strategy? It was so brilliant that it would soon have billionaire CEOs begging for mercy. The genius plan nobody saw coming. Here's where the story gets incredible. Most leaders would have called a press conference, demanded justice, and watched as international lawyers tied everything up in courts for decades while their people continued to starve. Traoré did the opposite. At 2 a.m., while the mining executives slept peacefully in their luxury hotels, Traoré assembled a war room that looked like something out of a spy thriller. But his weapons weren't guns or missiles. They were laptops, blockchain algorithms, and a 28-year-old computer genius named Fatou Diallo who was about to become the most dangerous person these CEOs had never heard of. "Here's what we're going to do," Traoré announced to his team. "We're going to let them think they've won. We're going to let them think we're just another African government that doesn't understand global finance." Dr. Ouadraogo looked confused. "But sir, with respect, why would we?" Traoré smiled. It was the smile of a chess master who had just seen checkmate 15 moves ahead. "Because while they're congratulating themselves on fooling us, we're going to be tracking every single dollar they've stolen, every fake transaction they've made, and every lie they've told, in real time." What Traoré had discovered was bigger than theft. It was a conspiracy. The mining companies hadn't just stolen from Burkina Faso. They had coordinated with each other, bribed officials across multiple governments, and created a systematic network designed to keep African nations poor while extracting their wealth. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had documented everything electronically. And Fatou Diallo was about to hack into all of it. the hacker who brought down Wall Street. This is where the story gets absolutely insane. Fatou Diallo grew up in a house with no electricity, but her mind burned brighter than any light bulb. While other kids played in the streets of Ouagadougou, she was teaching herself advanced computer programming from textbooks she borrowed from the university library. By age 16, she could hack into government databases. By age 20, she understood international financial systems better than most bank executives. By age 28, she was about to pull off the greatest digital investigation in African history. Working from a secret basement beneath the presidential palace, Fatou began tracing the digital footprints of every mining company operating in West Africa. What she found was more shocking than anyone had imagined. The mining companies had created parallel universes of accounting. For the African governments, they showed modest profits and reasonable royalty payments. For their shareholders, they showed massive wealth extraction that made their executives millionaires. But here's the smoking gun that changed everything. Fatou found their internal communications. And what those executives said to each other in private. It will make your blood boil. The recordings that shook the world. Brace yourself for this. The Burkina situation is basically printing money, laughed Marcus Blackwell in a recorded conference call with other mining executives. These African governments have no idea what they're sitting on, and frankly, it's better for everyone if we keep it that way. But it gets worse. Our geological surveys show the Ziniere deposit alone is worth $15 billion, added CFO Sarah Chin, but we're paying royalties based on an $800 million valuation. As long as we keep the local officials happy with their small payments, we can extract maximum value for shareholders. They were literally laughing about keeping an entire nation in poverty. Heinrich Kruger from European Mining Consortium was even more blunt. These are subsistence farmers and small-town politicians. Half of them never finished primary school. They wouldn't know a geological survey from a restaurant menu. But the conversation that made Traoré's blood run cold came when someone asked, "What if they figure it out?" Blackwell's response, "We have friends in Washington and London who make sure the World Bank and IMF keep these countries focused on other priorities. And if that doesn't work, well, there are always other options." They weren't just stealing money. They were actively working to keep African nations from discovering the theft. When Fatou showed these recordings to Traoré, he realized they weren't fighting individual companies. They were fighting a coordinated system designed to maintain African poverty for Western profit. But what he did next, it was pure genius. The trap that nobody expected. Here's where Traoré proved he was 10 steps ahead of everyone. Instead of immediately exposing the recordings, Traoré did something that seemed crazy. He announced that Burkina Faso was open for new mining partnerships. The Western executives laughed. Another desperate African leader trying to attract investment? They'd seen it 1,000 times. But what they didn't know was that Traoré had already reached out to Chinese, Russian, and Middle Eastern mining companies, and he had shared the real geological survey data with them. The same data that Western companies had been hiding for 20 years. Within weeks, Burkina Faso received offers that made the Western executives' heads spin. China's Sinosteel offered 35% royalties. Western companies were paying 8%. Russia's Polyus Gold offered a $3 billion upfront payment. UAE's Emirates Mining offered to build entire cities with mining profits. Suddenly, Marcus Blackwell found himself in the most uncomfortable position of his career. Either he matched these offers or he lost access to some of the world's richest gold deposits. But here's what made Traoré's strategy brilliant. He wasn't just negotiating for better deals. He was setting a trap. And every Western mining executive was about to walk right into it. The leak that changed everything. What happened next shocked the entire world. On October 15th, at exactly 9 a.m. Eastern Time, financial markets opened to chaos. WikiLeaks had just published the Africa Files, thousands of internal documents, emails, and recorded conversations from major mining companies operating across the continent. Stock prices collapsed instantly. Golden Star Mining, down 67%. Hemisphere Mining, down 73%. European Mining Consortium, down 81%. $47 billion in market value disappeared in the first hour. But here's what nobody knew. The leak didn't come from WikiLeaks' usual sources. It came from a secure server in Ouagadougou, uploaded by someone using the codename Sankara 2024. Ibrahim Traoré had just played his master card. The documents revealed everything: the systematic undervaluation of African mineral wealth, the coordination between companies to suppress royalty payments, the bribing of officials, and most damaging of all, the recorded conversations showing clear intent to keep African nations in poverty. CNN ran the story as breaking news for 3 straight days. The BBC called it the scandal that could reshape global mining. The Financial Times published a special investigation titled The $500 Billion Theft. But the real earthquake was just beginning. When Wall Street executives started begging. This is the part that will blow your mind. Within 72 hours of the leak, something unprecedented happened. The most powerful mining executives in the world were calling the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, begging for meetings. Marcus Blackwell, who 3 months earlier had dismissed African leaders as small-town politicians, was now on his private jet to Burkina Faso with a team of lawyers and a briefcase full of settlement offers. But when he walked into the Ministry of Mines conference room, he found something he had never experienced in 30 years of international business. He was completely powerless. President Traoré sat at the head of the table, flanked by international lawyers, UN observers, and a live video feed broadcasting to news networks around the world. "Mr. Blackwell," Traoré said calmly, "I believe you have something that belongs to the people of Burkina Faso." Blackwell's lawyer tried to negotiate. "Mr. President, my client is prepared to discuss a reasonable settlement." Traoré raised his hand. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is not a negotiation. This is a repatriation." The man who had once called Africans subsistence farmers was now at their mercy. Dr. Ouadraogo opened her laptop and began reading numbers that made the room fall silent. Based on your own internal geological surveys, actual extraction data, and international gold prices over the past 20 years, Western mining companies have extracted $78.2 billion worth of minerals from Burkina Faso while paying royalties based on declared values of $28.1 billion. She looked directly at Blackwell. The difference, $50.1 billion, represents stolen wealth that must be returned to its rightful owners. And this was just from one small African country. The domino effect that terrified corporate boardrooms. What happened next sent shockwaves through every mining company on Earth. Within weeks of Burkina Faso's revelations, something extraordinary began happening across Africa. Ghana announced a comprehensive audit of all mining operations. Mali followed. Then Tanzania. Then the Democratic Republic of Congo. Every African nation wanted their stolen billions back. The pattern was identical everywhere. Western mining companies had used the same fraudulent techniques, hidden the same geological surveys, and coordinated the same systematic theft across the entire continent. The total amount? Over $800 billion in stolen wealth. But here's what made the situation terrifying for Western executives. African leaders weren't operating independently anymore. They were coordinating their efforts, sharing intelligence, and using Traoré's model as a template. Marcus Blackwell's worst nightmare was coming true. An entire continent was waking up to how badly they had been robbed. His company's stock, which had been worth $12 billion before the revelations, was now essentially worthless. His personal wealth had evaporated. His Manhattan penthouse was being seized to pay restitution claims. And it was about to get worse. The justice that nobody expected. Here's where the story gets its ultimate revenge. The trials began 6 months later, broadcast live on international television. The same executives who had once treated African leaders like children were now sitting in defendant chairs, facing charges of fraud, conspiracy, and theft on a scale unprecedented in modern history. Marcus Blackwell, once worth $400 million, now faced 30 years in prison. His lawyers had advised him that his only option was complete cooperation with African governments seeking restitution. Heinrich Kruger's European Mining Consortium was broken up entirely, its assets sold to pay compensation claims across 14 African nations. But the most satisfying moment came when Sarah Chin, the CFO who had laughed about keeping local officials happy with small payments, was ordered to personally deliver a $2.3 billion check to the Children's Hospital in Ouagadougou that was being built with recovered mining wealth. The same executives who had mocked African poverty were now funding African prosperity. The transformation that amazed the world. What Burkina Faso became will restore your faith in justice. 2 years after Ibrahim Traoré's discovery in that dusty basement, Burkina Faso was unrecognizable. The $50 billion in recovered wealth had funded the most ambitious transformation in African history. Healthcare. Every citizen now had access to free medical care in hospitals equipped with technology that rivaled facilities in New York and London. Education. Children who had never seen electricity were now learning computer programming in schools powered by solar panels and connected to high-speed internet. Infrastructure. Roads, railways, and airports connected remote villages to global markets for the first time in history. Technology. Burkina Faso became Africa's first fully digital economy, with every transaction transparent and tracked through blockchain technology. But the most incredible change? The country's new sovereign wealth fund, managed with complete transparency, ensured that mineral wealth would benefit generations of Burkinabe citizens rather than foreign shareholders. A nation that had been kept in poverty was now showing the world what African prosperity looked like. The legacy that changed Africa forever. 5 years later, the impact was beyond anyone's imagination. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly, but he was no longer the young military officer who had stumbled upon dusty archives. He was now recognized as the leader who had proven that African nations could challenge and defeat the most powerful economic systems in the world. The theft of Africa's mineral wealth was not just an economic crime, he told the assembled world leaders. It was a crime against human potential. The numbers spoke for themselves. African nations had collectively reclaimed over $500 billion in stolen wealth. Infant mortality rates across the continent had dropped by 60%. Literacy rates had increased by 45%. Economic growth averaged 8% annually. Africa was now processing its own raw materials instead of exporting them for pennies. The Western mining executives who had once treated African leaders like subsistence farmers were now studying African innovations in transparent resource management, sustainable development, and blockchain-based governance. The students had become the teachers. Where are they now? The endings you need to hear. Marcus Blackwell, once worth $400 million, now works as a mining consultant for African governments, helping them identify extraction schemes he once orchestrated. His Manhattan penthouse? Sold to fund a technical university in Ouagadougou. Heinrich Kruger. His mining empire collapsed entirely. He disappeared from public view, reportedly living in a modest apartment in Prague, his billions now funding African development projects. Sarah Chin, the CFO who laughed about deceiving African governments, now manages a transparency foundation that helps developing nations audit their natural resource contracts. Fatou Diallo, the brilliant hacker who traced the theft, now heads the African Union Center for Digital Economic Security, helping other nations identify and prevent resource extraction fraud from a gleaming headquarters in Addis Ababa. Dr. Aminata Ouadraogo became the first African managing director of a reformed International Monetary Fund, which now prioritizes resource sovereignty over structural adjustment programs. Ibrahim Traoré remains president of Burkina Faso, but his legacy extends far beyond his country's borders. He proved that courage, intelligence, and strategic thinking could defeat even the most sophisticated systems of exploitation. The ending that will give you chills. In the hills outside Ouagadougou, where gold mines had once enriched foreign shareholders while local communities remained in poverty, a new city rises from the red African soil. Built with recovered mineral wealth and designed by African architects, it represents something that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier, an African vision of prosperity built on African resources for African people. The city's central plaza features a statue, not of President Traoré, but of an anonymous miner. One of the millions of Africans whose labor had built wealth for others for centuries. The inscription beneath reads, "To those who dug the gold but never shared the treasure. Your sacrifice was not in vain." Children play in parks built with gold revenues. Students study in universities funded by diamond profits. Families live in houses powered by energy from oil that now belongs to its landspeople rather than distant shareholders. Why this story matters more than you think. This isn't just a story about one African president outsmarting Western CEOs. This is a story about what happens when courage meets intelligence. When the oppressed refuse to stay oppressed. When technology becomes a weapon for justice instead of exploitation. Most importantly, this is a story about the future. Because what Ibrahim Traoré proved in Burkina Faso is spreading across the developing world. Nations that were once powerless against multinational corporations are learning that knowledge, strategy, and digital technology can level any playing field. The age of extractive colonialism, where rich countries got richer by keeping poor countries poor, is ending. And it's ending because a 34-year-old president from one of the world's poorest countries proved that David can still defeat Goliath. The boy from Ouagadougou who grew up watching foreign companies extract his country's wealth while his neighbors lived in poverty became the man who proved that even the most powerful systems of exploitation could be defeated. Not through violence, not through war, but through intelligence, courage, and an unshakable belief that every person deserves their fair share of the earth's abundance. The mining executives called him an ambitious colonel who didn't understand the global economy. They were wrong. He understood it perfectly. He just refused to accept that it had to be built on African poverty. What would you do if you discovered that your country had been robbed of $50 billion? Would you have the courage to take on the most powerful corporations in the world? Share this story and let us know in the comments below. The revolution has begun. And it started with one man, one discovery, and one unbreakable determination to seek justice.